he essentially lied to the voting public. He tried to convince everyone that he was a centrist, that he was going to handle things differently than Lightfoot. And, both when it comes to the question of migrants and the question of crime in Chicago, he's handled everything exactly the same as Lightfoot did.
Don't worry, it's just temporary. It's a temporary housing solution. To which my question is, okay, then what? Welcome to No Border, No Country. We're talking about Chicago today, Judge Matt O'Brien, and as much as I'd like to talk to you about the 86 Bears and the Chicago Bulls under Michael Jordan, we're talking about the city of Chicago and how it's basically falling apart in a large part because of these incredibly bad sanctuary policies.
Yeah, I think this is like the old Saturday Night Live skit where we need an alcoholic beverage to talk about Chicago. Complete insanity. So they're now at the point where they're talking about giving $9,000 per alien to each migrant over the course of 6 months to pay for housing.
What was that A word you said?
Migrant, the M word. The M word.
Okay. It's gotten worse. You know, everyone thought when Lori Lightfoot was the mayor, it can't get worse. And then now they got this guy Brandon Johnson in there now, and it's worse. And for many reasons.
Well, he essentially lied to the voting public. He tried to convince everyone that he was a centrist, that he was going to handle things differently than Lightfoot. And, both when it comes to the question of migrants and the question of crime in Chicago, he's handled everything exactly the same as Lightfoot did, which is he is concerned about the wants and needs of foreign nationals that don't vote in the United States for whatever reason, because it fits with a particular political narrative. But he's paying no attention to the citizens of Chicago who can't walk out to go shopping without getting shot. And it just doesn't make any sense. And clearly, American political leaders of a certain stripe don't know how to read the room.
In a city like Chicago, where it's one party rules, it seems like everyone's of the same mind politically in that town at times. I think a lot of people expect the people of Chicago to go about their lives like Muscovites living in Soviet Russia in the worst of the Cold War, going off to the mill to produce their products, their menial jobs. We see this slight glimpse of hope in that the people of Chicago seem to be pushing back. Tell me about that.
Well, they do appear to be pushing back. You see a lot of people showing up at town meetings in Chicago. This is the thing. American politics has largely become a kabuki. It's a dance where the form is observed, but there's no substance to it. And so they're holding town meetings to discuss all of this. Yet they don't appear to be listening, any of the leaders in Chicago, the aldermen, the mayor, to what their constituents are saying. And what people are saying is, listen, we've got enough trouble in our neighborhoods with gangs and crime, and the gang and the crime problems to a large extent are being driven by migration. Now you're adding migrants, 4 buses of them, I think, over the last couple of days, to our neighborhoods, and you're talking about putting up tent cities in the Chicago winter. Now, as we've seen in New York, a lot of these migrants, who are all military-aged males, not family units, who are allegedly seeking asylum, although it's not exactly clear what they're seeking asylum from, since most of these places have a homicide rate that's significantly lower than Chicago. You're actually safer in El Salvador, Nicaragua, or Guatemala than you are in a typical weekend in Chicago. And as we've seen with the hotels in New York, there's fights erupting. A lot of the migrants don't have anything to do, so they drink, they do drugs. There's incidences in New York of them having sex on the streets or in the hallways of the hotels where they're being housed. And people in Chicago don't want this. They've seen what's going on in New York. The New Yorkers, for whatever reason, haven't been speaking out to the same extent. about this, although the New York authorities don't seem to be holding the town halls to the extent that Chicago is. There's been more protests on the street in New York, but in Chicago, there's been this attempt to give the impression that the political leaders are listening to their constituents, and yet they're not, because the mayor is firmly committed to providing taxpayer assistance so that migrants can find housing. They're not responding to the concerns that people in some of the more economically challenged neighborhoods in Chicago have, and they're not responding to the claims that people are making about the scarceness of resources.
So there have been a couple incidents in the last few weeks in Chicago that we're going to get to, and we've got some video to back that up. So the first one we're going to look at here, a group of citizens is filing a lawsuit against the city and Mayor Johnson. So let's take a look at that.
I'm standing here tonight with buyer's remorse because I supported Mayor Brandon Johnson. I feel like a fool right now. I feel like a plum fool. But I tell you what, it's okay. Because as I said last night, you can slap us in the face by ignoring us today, but we are punching you in the face by ignoring you at the polling places tomorrow.
So these are not the obedient citizens that mayors of Chicago are used to dealing with.
No, not by any stretch of the imagination. But, this is inevitable. This is what everyone who is an advocate for immigration enforcement has said was going to happen in these sanctuary cities. And it's happening. And people aren't liking it. I mean, we've been involved in this for years. When I was over at Early's associate organization, FAIR, I did reports linking unchecked mass migration to increases in crime. And you have to ask, if somebody will break a law to get into the United States because they find the immigration law inconvenient to their purposes, what other laws are they going to break? And this is what's happening in places like New York and Chicago. People who started their relationship with the United States by being lawless are coming into neighborhoods and behaving lawlessly, which shouldn't surprise anyone. Now, in New York, this is particularly shocking. I lived in New York City in the Giuliani era, and, you could go into Times Square at 2 o'clock in the morning and be perfectly safe because every fifth person that you bumped into was an NYPD officer or a bridge and tunnel police officer or a Port Authority police officer, and they took crime seriously. What New Yorkers are now dealing with is with the defund the police movements and the refusal to take crime seriously. They're dealing with a general breakdown in law and order, which is being exacerbated by the fact that they've had, depending upon who you ask, somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 100,000 people added to the population. And they're not people who are going about the business of contributing to the civic life of a city. They're people with nothing to do that are laying around on the sidewalks and causing problems. Chicago's having the exact same issue. Unfortunately, Chicago never got itself cleaned up. And so Chicago is dealing with this on top of growing crime. I mean, you're probably safer on an average weekend in Beirut than you are in Chicago when you look at the number of shootings that are going on. And so this just adds another layer of lawlessness to things. And the fact is that average working people who just want to go about their business, work their jobs, enjoy their homes and families in Chicago aren't able to do it. And so they're getting a little salty with the politicians that have visited this on them.
Now, they're filing a lawsuit against, I believe it's Johnson and the city. Putting on your judge's robe there for a moment, what obligation does the mayor of a city have to actually spend the resources of that city on the citizens? Is there anything that mandates that, or what's the?
A lot of it depends on issues of municipal financial ordinances and state law. A lot of these lawsuits have issues with standing on whether people can sue or not. I think the fact that's important here is not the procedural technicalities behind how they're suing or even what they're suing over. It's the fact that these folks have gotten irritated enough to actually seek a legal remedy because they feel like the mayor of Chicago, along with the aldermen on the Chicago City Council, are failing them, that they're not protecting the citizens. And a couple of videos that I've seen, people have pointed out there's all kinds of American homeless on the streets of Chicago who are sleeping on cardboard on the sidewalks, many of them veterans of the U.S. Armed Forces. And yet the mayor of Chicago was at a press conference saying, hey, all of the people in Chicago should stop getting upset. What I'm talking about is getting these people off of floors, which has prompted a lot of Chicago residents to say, why don't you get the U.S. citizens off the sidewalks before you worry about getting the migrants off the floors? And then they've done ridiculous things, just like, New York City decided to house some ridiculously large number of migrants in the commercial cruise ship terminal, which had been rated in a bunch of cruise ship magazines as being the nicest cruise ship terminal in the country. And, of course, the migrants came in there and treated it the way, the members of the Animal House fraternity treated their frat house. And, of course, then the New Yorkers all panicked, all of the political leaders, and went, maybe this wasn't the best idea. Well, Chicago, they're housing people on the floors in police stations. So you're in a city that's experiencing an unprecedented crime wave, and yet the police have got to worry about migrants, let's call it what it is, people who are unlawfully present in the United States pursuant to bogus asylum claims. And so the police are going to be tripping over these folks as they're going in and out trying to police this city. And then you have, for some reason, they thought it'd be a good idea to put migrants at O'Hare Airport. So airports are secure facilities. If you or I want to get into the back rooms at an airport, you have to have what's called a TWIC card, a Transit Worker Identity Card, which TSA issues after you've been extensively vetted. So, the security is so important at airports that we have to vet the United States citizens that work at them, but we're going to get a whole bunch of newly arrived military-age males and let them hang around the airport all day because we don't have any other place to put them. And stop and think about that for a minute. When's the last time you picked somebody up in your car at the airport? It's like you slow down long enough to put your relative in the car and put their luggage in, and you got a police officer running you off because you've been there too long. And yet we have illegals all over O'Hare.
You get a sense, both in Chicago and New York, just the two biggest examples, it's very ad hoc. It doesn't seem like there's a plan. It just seems like they're scrambling and they're desperate. We'll put them in a hotel. We'll put them in a school gymnasium. We'll put them in. They're just looking for anything with a roof and heat, I guess, to put them in. And we've got this case now in Chicago where this is a Brighton Park section of town. The city wants to build this migrant tent, which is this massive thing on a 10-acre facility. And this is the latest subject of the residents' ire, that they're coming in and doing these protests. So we have a video of that, too. Can we see that as well? And then I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, Matt.
Brighton Park neighbors have been protesting this possible migrant tent camp location for hours now, even launching fireworks at one point. Residents we spoke with say they feel betrayed by city leadership and are concerned for their safety. Making lots of noise at the corner of 38th and California. Brighton Park neighbors loudly voiced their frustrations over a proposed migrant tent base camp right across the street from where this band of residents is stewing with anger.
This is unfair to them. This is a slap in the face to immigrants who have worked hard their entire lives to get here, who have raised their children with a hard work ethic.
Okay, so the residents are ticked off, to say the least. One thing I saw, I watched the town hall as well, one of the bureaucrats who was up there trying to quell the masses was saying, don't worry, it's just temporary. It's a temporary housing solution. To which my question is, okay, then what? Because they're not leaving. We know that. They're here to stay, as they love to say. So at some point, they're going to have to go somewhere else. So, yeah, okay, fine, it's temporary. Where are you going to put them next?
That's a good question. I mean, if they don't have any place to put them now, they're not going to have any place to put them later. Yeah. And, this shows just how little all of these advocates for open borders actually really care about migrants, because this is Chicago. Now, I grew up in New England, winter in places like New England and Chicago is not mild like it is here in D.C. You get seriously cold temperatures, snow. They call Chicago the Windy City. So they're going to take these people and they're going to put them in a tent? I mean, we constantly get told that these people have to be allowed in here because their conditions are not as nice as those of the United States and because it would be discriminatory. And, we have resources and food and a good life here in the U.S., so why wouldn't we let these people in here? Well, if you honestly believe that, there has to be some happy medium between luxury hotels in New York at taxpayer expense or a tent in a park in Chicago. And, I find this amusing because when Muammar Gaddafi came to visit the UN, he wanted to set up his Bedouin tent that he claimed he lived in Central Park. And the New York City authorities wouldn't allow him to do that. So I'm guessing that if a tent isn't appropriate for Muammar Gaddafi, it shouldn't be appropriate for these folks. But this is the absurdity of this all. It's like for political reasons, the people that advocate open borders wanted these folks here. They had no plan for how they were going to handle this, for how they were going to pay for it, how they were going to handle practical considerations like feeding and housing these folks. And this is the most creative thing that in America, the most innovative country in the world, that one of the leaders of a great world-leading financial and cultural center can come up with. Well, why don't we set up a tent? This will be great.
Now, Matt, in all fairness, we're dealing with big government bureaucrats here. When they're spending other people's money, i.e. the taxpayers' money, on something like a tent, you can rest assured it's going to be a pretty good tent. They're going to spend a lot of money on it.
Well, I'm sure they're going to spend a lot of money on it. That doesn't mean that it's a very good tent. Chicago just spent, I think, $7.2 million for a week of medical staffing from a contractor at one of the migrant respite centers. So this is the kind of foolishness. This is just, it's bad government policy bootstrapped by opportunities for crony capitalism and, for opportunities for people to make money by committing fraud on the public. And, if you stop and think about this is a very different handling of this type of situation versus the Mariel boatlift. And, despite Al Pacino's character in Scarface saying that he tell President Carter, I want my human rights. The fact is the Mariel boatlift was handled very, very differently. There was a major concern about security, and people were housed in a stadium in a warmer climate. And so they localized all of the people that came in the Mariel boatlift, I think, in two locations in Miami and Atlanta. They were kept there until they could be properly processed, and there was a huge Border Patrol and then INS officer presence to try and ensure the security of the American public. The government has no idea who any of these people are. They have no idea why they're really here. We don't know how many of them are foreign intelligence operatives, how many of them have affiliations with terrorist organizations. There's been about 800 people that are on the terrorist watch list and from special interest countries that the Border Patrol, briefly apprehended and interviewed before, under the current administration's policies, they were turned loose into the United States. So this is several different kinds of disasters waiting to happen. And, I'm happy to see the normal, average, everyday American residents of Chicago saying enough is enough. And if you look at this video, many of these people are immigrants themselves. And the woman who was acting as the spokesperson pointed out that this is an affront. It's a slap in the face to people who obeyed the immigration laws and did what they were supposed to do in order to come here correctly.
Now, if you look at New York City Mayor Eric Adams, i.e. Hamlet on the Hudson, he seems like he's always just, he's so conflicted, because on one sense he's a sanctuary mayor. On the other hand, He's a former police officer, so he's got some kind of law enforcement instinct in him. And he can see with objective eyes that these sanctuary policies are a disaster. So he's kind of going on both sides of the fence. One day he's pro-sanctuary, next day he's saying, there's no more room at the inn, we can't handle anymore, Joe Biden, write me a check, or whatever. That does not seem to be the case in Chicago, where the leader, I use that term loosely, of Chicago is 100% sanctuary. He's pro-sanctuary. And he's made some speeches out there that are just jaw-dropping. And we've got one here he did recently, and I'd like to dissect this a little bit because it's just
Certainly.
the cognitive dissonance on it is staggering.
Thank you for the question. This is not about votes. This is the problem here. If people think that my job is solely based on how I can get the next vote, we'll get to that in the next 3 years. But I got you. Hold on a second. I just want to make sure that I don't want people to believe that the political decisions that the right wing in this country is making is going to force me to make a decision that will go against our values because I'm thinking about votes. Here's what I'm most concerned about. Our constituents and residents of the city of Chicago. I got it. My bigger concern is the fact that we have an alt-right movement, not just in this country, but around the globe, that continues to disrupt black and brown economies.
Okay, he goes off in a weird direction here, but go ahead, stop it. Now, he may sound deranged, but you got to admit he's a slick operator. He can take evidence that's clear to anyone else and turn it around and say, no, that's not what you're seeing. What you're seeing is this.
Well, I wonder if that's evidence of what a slick operator he is, or whether it's evidence that he's just not that bright. Both possibilities are probably equally probable. But, to hear him say that, one, he's not worried about votes, that's ridiculous. Show me a politician that's not worried about votes, and I'll show you a politician that's not going to win the next election. When he says that it's the right wing that is doing this, it's not the right wing that's doing this. Under the prior president, the border was as secure as it's ever been. I mean, I've been working in immigration for 30 years, and under President Trump, the border was the most secure that I've ever seen it in the entire time that I have been working in this field. And that was despite the best efforts of his ideological opponents attempting to funnel as many people into the United States as they could possibly get. And then this black and brown economies. I don't even know what that means. We're all Americans here. And if he's worried about the effect the right wing is having on economies in other countries, then maybe he ought to get a job with the UN. But his responsibility is to the voters of Chicago. They don't want to be a sanctuary city anymore. I think the voters in Chicago need to go and speak at the polls and vote for somebody who doesn't want these kind of policies. But, for him to be saying, oh, this is all the fault of the right wing somehow, well, I mean, that doesn't pass the smell test. There's no way that you can hear that and keep a straight face, because this is the direct result of sanctuary policies, which he and his ilk have supported when they weren't directly affected by this, when this was a problem that San Antonio, Texas needed to deal with. They weren't worried about it. Sanctuary policies were the greatest thing in the entire world. But now that they have been forced to confront the results of their badly considered policies directly, they don't like them, and yet they're not intellectually honest enough to admit, okay, maybe that was a bad policy, it's time for a change.
It should be said over and over again when we hear things like that. Johnson and all the other sanctuary mayors, they asked for this. They did not say, we're a sanctuary city until we hit 10,000 migrants and then we're going to stop. They said, the more the merrier. They make us stronger. Bring them on. And then they got them, and now they're crying the blues.
Well, and their claim for being sanctuary cities is there's plenty of room, there's plenty of money, These people are all coming here seeking a better life. Immigrants are absolutely essential. In fact, they're better than Americans because they're more entrepreneurial. They work harder. They complain less, et cetera, et cetera. Everything that is happening in Chicago and New York right now is undermining those tropes. First of all, there isn't enough room. They can't even find a place for these people to lay their heads. Second of all, none of these people seem particularly interested in working. They seem interested in collecting whatever they can get from the American taxpayer, despite claims from all of these politicians saying, oh, we got to change the work authorization laws so we can put these folks to work. And it's not abundantly clear that anybody has a plan for how to get these people who don't appear to have any marketable skills and don't speak English into our economy. And you know, his thing about disrupting black and brown economies is, other than being patently offensive, it just doesn't make any sense, because what's disrupting the economies in all of the countries that he's referring to is the fact that everyone who is at a point in their life where they're of working age and would tend to be entrepreneurial or politically motivated is leaving. So there's a huge brain and labor drain in these companies. These countries. And then what happens is all of these countries become addicted to remittance payments that are sent back from people working in the United States, which U.S. taxpayers are subsidizing by all of these benefits that they're giving to these people. So this is like just a big, bad karmic furnace that leads to bad ends for absolutely everybody involved.
I'm Tom Homan. The Biden administration is reversing America's progress on immigration, reversing ICE's ability to deport criminal illegal aliens, reversing job protections for Americans, and construction of the wall. That's why I've joined EARLY, the Immigration Reform Law Institute. EARLY uses the courts to stop bad immigration policies. Join me. Support EARLY at early.org. Help win the immigration fight in the courtroom. Paid for by the Immigration Reform Law Institute.
So, Matt, we were talking about Brandon Johnson and these sanctuary mayors, and if you search previous speeches of Brandon Johnson, you'll hear all kinds of word salad he throws around. And one of the things he says is, well, we can walk and chew gum at the same time, meaning he can serve the citizens of Chicago as well as these migrants. Back to what you said earlier, you know, they can accommodate the people they've invited. And if you show me a Chicago where it's safe, the economy's prosperous, there's plenty of housing for everyone, there's basically no homeless problem, the drug addiction problem's under control, there's not 50 people shot every weekend, the coffers are full in the city, I would say, fine, let's do some good. Let's bring in some people that are desperately in need of help, and maybe we'll throw some charity their way. They are failing on all those counts. It's a meat grinder. There's people shot every weekend. There's violence all over the place. The city's going broke. There's homelessness. There's drug addiction. There's all these problems. They are not suited to taking this extra challenge on that no one is forcing them to take on, that they're voluntarily taking on.
No, and the fact that there is crime and that they have a huge problem with homelessness and unemployment is evidence of other bad policies. And so these bad policies with regard to migrants are just part of the same issue. And I would disagree with you slightly. I would say if conditions are ideal and you're in a position to do some good, well, then do some good for some American poor people that are living in Appalachia in horrid conditions. And tell these folks that are supposedly upset with the conditions in Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador, stay home and fix the problems. I mean, the fact is, despite the Marxist narrative that the United States is responsible for all the problems in the rest of the world, and I think Johnson mentioned this at one point in his screed there, talking about, bad American foreign policy is why these people need to leave these countries. These folks don't need to leave these countries because of bad American foreign policy. They need to stay home and fix the problems and make these countries livable if they're indeed not livable. But the fact is, most of that is false anyways. As I said, a lot of these places, the homicide rates are significantly lower than Baltimore or Washington, D.C. I've heard thousands of these asylum cases. A lot of them are completely bogus. You have people that are, they claim they're afraid of MS-13, and yet it's patently obvious that they were living in a rural village somewhere where they've never seen a gang member. And all this does is undermine the ability of the United States to provide protections for people who are genuinely in need, like people fleeing persecution in Iran, things of that nature.
It's also interesting to hear Johnson and other sanctuary mayors talk, because it seems like they're operating from a series of flawed assumptions. And the most obvious one is that, and we saw it in what he said earlier, that they have an obligation. We have an obligation to bring these people on, and he's referred to it in other speeches as we have this burden we have to take on. Where is it written in the bylaws of the city of Chicago that the mayor has to play this global good Samaritan and take on all these people when the city can't afford it? I mean, why do they feel this need to overstep their bounds as elected officials and save the world, essentially, when really their job is fix the jurisdiction you've been elected to, improve the quality of life there for the people who live there, who are residents there? Why is there this disconnect?
It's a lack of intellectual integrity. I mean, the fact is that he's claiming that he has this burden to the world to do this, and yet out the other side of his mouth, he's saying, oh, we don't have any obligation to participate in federal immigration enforcement because that's an entirely federal issue. Well, as a matter of the Constitution and a matter of the Supreme Court's precedent, the fact is immigration is a federal issue, and Chicago and New York and all these other places shouldn't have anything to say about it except to the extent that they're participating in the process of democratic governance, and they're going to their federal elected leaders and saying X, Y, and Z that the federal government is doing is a problem. Well, funny, they're waking up and doing that now after they participated in this farce of virtue signaling BS that is the sanctuary city movement. So it's kind of ridiculous, because this is pretty simple and straightforward. Once upon a time, immigration wasn't a party-oriented issue. It was a nonpartisan issue where both of the parties agreed that border security was fundamental to the integrity of national sovereignty, and therefore you didn't want people coming over the border in droves to work illegally in the United States or to engage in nefarious behavior here in the United States. And the debate was over the extent to which legal immigration should be expanded or contracted, and whether certain groups of people should be given an amnesty, like agricultural workers. Now, I'm not a fan of amnesties. Anybody who's a parent or who has babysat small children knows that if you encourage bad behavior, you just get more bad behavior. And an amnesty is just a reward for bad behavior. But here's the interesting thing. If these folks were honest, in order to prove that they are Democrats or whatever party that they're from, they don't have to hew to this ridiculous line of these policies that kind of fall like dominoes when confronted with reality. There was a time when Democrats, might have been extremely liberal on some issues, but then very law and order on others. And the fact is that Chuck Schumer and Hillary Clinton advocated for border walls and border fencing. Bill Clinton spearheaded the enactment of the most restrictive amendments to the Immigration and Nationality Act while he was president, and he seemed to have genuinely had a commitment to immigration enforcement. So it's this is kind of craziness to hear these folks saying, well, we have this obligation. No, your obligation as an elected leader is to the citizens of the United States. Leave the foreign policy to the federal government.
Isn't it curious, too, that it seems like these sanctuary mayors want to have it both ways, in that Eric Adams, who we've dissected many ways on this show, he will say, on one hand, well, Washington, you owe us money, the White House essentially, to compensate for the losses we've incurred as a result of this. However, they were asking for it all this time. So is it really, can they really claim they were bait and switched by the White House when they were on record as wanting this all along?
No, they were active participants in this. And it's like I said, there's no planning. See, this is the problem. I think it was Margaret Thatcher once said, the trouble with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money. This is what happens when politicians are busy spending the taxpayers' money on their pet causes as if it were their own. And then when they run out of it, they don't have any more money to pay for all of these special pandering to constituents programs. And, you know, the fact is that Chicago has a history of political corruption, much like New York City, Jersey City, St. Louis, a number of major cities in the United States. And that can happen at the real obvious level where people are engaged in embezzlement and things like that, or it can happen at a low level where there's just political deals made. And so this to me looks like a bad policy that wasn't thought through, that now has presented an opportunity for things like $7.2 million contracts for a week's worth of medical services that you throw to your friends who then turn around and make a political donation. So it's just absurd. And the one fundamental question that everyone should be asking in this is, where is the concern for the United States citizens at the federal level, at the state level, at the mayoral level in these places? We're spending all this time worrying about people who basically abandoned their own countries when those countries were in crisis and came here. And yet we're acting as if those folks are more important than U.S. citizens, than people who cast votes in U.S. elections. And it just doesn't make any sense. And if you stop and think about it, I know it's very easy for me, warm and well-fed, to sit here and say these people are abandoning their countries in time of need. But if it weren't for the fact that the founding fathers of this country said, the way I need to be governed in order to live a life of freedom and accomplish that which I set out to accomplish here in the New World, if that means I got to put my life on the line, then I'm going to do that to ensure that I have the kind of God-given rights that I should have. All of these folks that are streaming across the border here aren't doing that in their own country. And, you know, if Thomas Jefferson and Sam Adams and Paul Revere and all these folks had gone, time to go to Germany. Weather's nice this year and this time of year in Switzerland. You know, we'd still have the Queen on the money, and the military would be wearing red coats, and the Navy would be worrying about sailing the Spanish Main. I mean, it's just absurd that people who are supposedly carrying the political torch of the legacy that the founding fathers set up in this country aren't worried about the perpetuation of American traditions and American ideals. They're worried about making a bunch of ungrateful guests that have done nothing but cause problems since they get here happy.
Well, Matt, this is under control, I thought. Don't we have the border czar who lives at the Naval Observatory, who was going to go down there and get all this corporate investment in Latin America, and that was going to turn down the magnet and they'd all stay there? I mean, isn't that under control? I thought we had that solved.
Well, this is also the person that went to one of our closest allies and said, we value our relationship with North Korea. I'm sure anybody can make a mistake in a microphone. I'm sure I've mispronounced things, said things incorrectly as we're speaking here. That's human nature. But when you're the vice president of the United States and you're abroad on a diplomatic mission and you're trying to butter up one of our most important allies that's essential for strategic defense and for the pursuit of American interests in Asia, when you go and say that you value our relationship with their communist, brutal, torturing, no respect for its citizens, northern neighbor, that's a giant embarrassment. So the fact that she hasn't been able to do anything productive with regards to the border crisis is not shocking. Of course, I think in order to do something like that, she would need to actually go to the border, and my understanding is the closest she's been was downtown San Antonio.
Isn't it curious how that whole border czar thing just got mothballed overnight? It seems like she dove into it and said, wait a minute, this isn't easy. This is hard. I'm not going to do this.
Yeah, and I mean, they were never serious about it anyways, which is why it's got mothballed. But, you know, you have to wonder, what is in the heads of Joe Biden and Ali Mayorkas? So you just look at all this, and it's like, what the heck are these people thinking? The voters of the United States put these people in office to govern on behalf of the citizens of America and to preserve a way of life and make it better if possible. And yet, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, our border czar, seem to be focused on improving the lot of the citizens of foreign nations at the expense of U.S. citizens, rather than attempting to do what the voters put them in office to do.
Congratulations, you made it to the end of the podcast. If you found this information useful, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. If you'd like to learn about the Immigration Reform Law Institute, go to irli.org. And to support the show and early, go to irli.org/podcast. You can also hear this podcast on a number of platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. And be sure and check us out on all the major social media platforms. Thanks a lot.